In September 1802, a Richmond, Virginia newspaper published an article that sent shockwaves through the young American Republic. The President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, the man who had penned the immortal words, "All men are created equal," was keeping one of his slaves as a concubine. Her name was Sally, and she had borne him several children. The scandal erupted in the middle of Jefferson's presidency. Political enemies seized the story like a weapon. Newspapers printed obscene cartoons. Ministers condemned him from pulpits across the nation. But Jefferson never responded, never denied, never confirmed. He simply maintained silence, and that silence would endure for 2 centuries. What the newspaper didn't reveal was even more disturbing. Sally Hemings wasn't just his slave. She was the half-sister of his dead wife. The 2 women shared the same father. When Jefferson's wife died, he inherited Sally. She was 9 years old. 18 years later, Sally had given birth to 6 children, all fathered by the same man, all born into slavery, all with skin light enough to pass as white, all bearing Thomas Jefferson's features. This is the story of how the author of the Declaration of Independence came to have a secret family with his dead wife's sister, how a 16-year-old girl became pregnant by the most powerful man in America, why Sally agreed to return from Paris when she could have claimed her freedom, and how they lived under the same roof for 38 years while everyone who knew did nothing to stop it. The answer begins in 1787, when Thomas Jefferson brought Sally Hemings to Paris. She arrived at 14 while he was 44. She was still legally his property. And there, in the City of Enlightenment, he made her a promise that would alter both their destinies forever. This is the story America tried to bury for 2 centuries. The story that only DNA could finally confirm. The story of the president and the slave who was his dead wife's sister, Virginia, 1782. Thomas Jefferson was 39 years old. Lawyer, politician, architect, philosopher. He had written the Declaration of Independence 6 years earlier. He was respected throughout the new nation. He owned a plantation called Monticello, hundreds of acres worked by enslaved people. He was a man of principles, or so he claimed. In September of that year, his wife Martha died after giving birth to their 6th child. Jefferson was devastated. He spent 3 weeks locked in his room. When he finally emerged, he made a solemn vow. He would never remarry, never replace Martha. He kept that promise, but he found another way not to be alone. Martha Wales Jefferson had brought a considerable dowry to her marriage. Land, money, and slaves. Among those slaves was the Hemings family, Elizabeth Hemings and her children. One of those children was Sally. She was 9 years old when Martha died, small, slender, light-skinned with long, straight hair. She didn't look like an African slave because she wasn't entirely African. Her father was John Wales, Martha's father, Jefferson's father-in-law. Sally Hemings was the half-sister of Jefferson's dead wife, and now she was his property. When Martha Jefferson died, Thomas inherited everything she had brought to the marriage. That included the Hemings family. Elizabeth Hemings was the matriarch, 57 years old. She had been enslaved to John Wales, Martha's father. She had borne 12 children. 6 of them were fathered by John Wales himself. They were Martha's half-siblings, enslaved brothers and sisters carrying their own father's blood. One of those children was Sally, 9 years old when she arrived at Monticello. Sally didn't work in the fields, which was unusual. Enslaved children typically began field work at 7 or 8, but Sally was assigned to the main house. She worked as a chambermaid, helped in the kitchen, served at table, cleaned rooms. She was near the white Jefferson family. Constantly. That too was unusual. Jefferson had strict rules about which slaves could be in the house, but Sally and her siblings were different. They were Martha's family, Wales blood. That gave them certain privileges other slaves didn't have years past. Sally grew up. Jefferson spent most of his time in politics. He traveled constantly, served as Virginia's governor, then was sent to France as minister. In 1784, Jefferson departed for Paris. He took his oldest daughter, Patsy, who was 11. He left his 2 younger daughters in Virginia with relatives. He planned to stay only 2 years. He stayed 5. During those years, Jefferson lived in Paris as a diplomat. He had an elegant house on the Champs-Élysées. He attended dinners with French nobles, met philosophers and artists, enjoyed European culture. But he missed his daughters. In 1787, he decided it was time to bring Polly, his 9-year-old daughter, to Paris. He wrote to his brother-in-law in Virginia. He needed the child sent by ship, and she needed to travel with a companion, a responsible adult woman who could care for her during the 6-week crossing. But when the ship arrived in London in June 1787, the person who disembarked with Polly wasn't an adult woman. It was Sally Hemings. She was 14 years old. The ship's captain wrote Jefferson explaining the situation. The woman who was supposed to accompany Polly had fallen ill at the last moment. The family decided to send Sally instead. The captain wrote that Sally was a very pleasant girl who had cared well for Polly throughout the voyage, that the child was healthy and happy. Jefferson received the letter. He expressed no anger about the change of plans. He simply made arrangements for both to travel from London to Paris. Sally arrived in Paris in mid-July. It was hot. The city was full of life. Sally had never left Virginia, never seen a city so large, never seen so many people. Jefferson received them at his house. He embraced Polly then. Looked at Sally. She had changed. She was no longer the 9-year-old child he remembered. She was 14 now. Tall, slender, with long straight hair, light skin, delicate features. She resembled someone. Martha, Jefferson's dead wife. This was no coincidence. Sally and Martha were sisters. They shared the same genes, the same features. Sally was like a ghost from the past, a living reminder of the woman Jefferson had loved. Jefferson decided Sally would stay in Paris. He wouldn't send her back to Virginia. Polly needed a constant companion, someone to care for her. Sally would fill that role. But Sally also needed training. In France, servants were more refined than in Virginia. Jefferson paid for Sally to learn French, to improve her sewing, to learn French manners. Sally spent 2 years in Paris learning, growing, living in a city where slavery didn't legally exist, where slaves could petition courts for their freedom, where they could be free. Sally lived in Jefferson's house. She slept in a small room upstairs. She helped dress Patsy and Polly. She accompanied them to school, shopped at markets, learned the language. Neighbors saw her as a servant, not as a slave, because technically she wasn't. On French soil, Sally was free. She could leave if she wanted. She could stay in France, could petition for asylum, could begin a new life. But she was 14 years old. She was alone. She knew no one. She had no money, no family except the Jeffersons. Where would she go? Jefferson spent much time at home during those years. He didn't travel as much as before. He worked from his study, received visitors, wrote letters. And he watched. He watched Sally move through the house, watched how quickly she learned French, watched how Polly adored her, watched how every day she resembled Martha more. Every gesture, every movement, every smile. It was like having Martha back, but younger, more vulnerable, and completely dependent on him. It's unclear exactly when it began. The records don't say. The documents are vague, but sometime between 1787 and 1789, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings began a relationship. He was 44 years old. She was 16. He was the United States minister to France. She was his slave. He was free to do whatever he wished. She had no real options. That is the nature of power. That is the nature of slavery. It didn't matter that they were in France. It didn't matter that technically she was free. The power between them was so unequal that the word consent had no real meaning. In autumn 1789, Jefferson received news from the United States. George Washington had been elected president, and Washington wanted Jefferson in his cabinet as Secretary of State. Jefferson would have to return to Virginia, would have to leave Paris. He began making preparations, packed his books, his furniture, his documents, purchased ship passages departing in October. 2 passages for his daughters, 1 for James Hemings, Sally's brother who worked as his chef, and 1 for Sally. But Sally didn't want to leave. For the first time in her life, she had something resembling freedom. In Paris, no one treated her as a slave. She could walk the streets alone, could speak to whomever she wished, could dream of a different future. If she returned to Virginia, all that would end. She would become property again, become a slave again, have no rights again, have no voice again. And there was something else. Sally was pregnant. She was 16 years old. She was in a foreign country, carrying the child of the man who technically owned her. According to the testimony of her son Madison Hemings, given many years later, Sally refused to return. She told Jefferson she would stay in France, that she could be free there, that her child would be born free. Jefferson couldn't force her, not legally, not in France. So he did the only thing he could do. He begged, he made promises. He promised that if she returned to Virginia, he would treat her well, that she would have privileges, that she would never work the fields, and most importantly, he promised that all her children would be freed when they turned 21. That was the promise, freedom, not for her, but for her children, for the next generation. Sally was 16 years old. She was pregnant. She was alone. She knew no one in France except the Jeffersons. She had no money, no place to go. Jefferson's promises were all she had, so she agreed. In October 1789, Sally Hemings boarded a ship bound for Virginia. She was 3 months pregnant. She traveled with the father of her child, the man who was her owner, the man who had been married to her half-sister. She was returning to a life of slavery because it was the only option she had, or at least the only option she could see. Sally Hemings arrived back at Monticello in November 1789. She was 5 months pregnant. No one asked questions. The slaves knew it was better not to ask. Jefferson's white family didn't ask either, or if they suspected something, they kept silent. Sally was assigned back to the main house, not to the fields, not to the slave kitchens, to the house, near Jefferson, near his daughters, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. In 1790, Sally gave birth to her first child. There's no record of the name, no record of the exact date, only a brief note in Jefferson's documents indicating a baby had been born. And then another note. The baby died a few weeks after birth. The cause is unknown. Infant diseases were common. Mortality was high, especially among slaves. Sally was 17 years old. She had lost her first child. Jefferson wrote nothing about it in his private letters, didn't mention the birth, didn't mention the death, as if it hadn't happened. Jefferson was appointed Secretary of State under President George Washington. That meant he would spend much time in Philadelphia, where the capital was located then. But he returned to Monticello frequently. Every few months, he'd stay for weeks, sometimes months. And every time he returned, Sally was there, waiting, working, living in a small room in the south building of the plantation, a room next to Jefferson's. That wasn't normal. Slaves didn't live in rooms next to their masters, but Sally wasn't a normal slave, and everyone at Monticello knew it. In 1795, Sally gave birth to a daughter. They named her Harriet. She was light-skinned, very light, so light she could pass for white. She had Jefferson's features, the eyes, the shape of the face. Anyone who saw them together could notice. But no one said anything. Harriet lived 2 years, then died. Again, no record of the cause. Again, Jefferson wrote nothing about it. 2 dead children. Sally was 22 years old. She had lost 2 babies and was still a slave. In 1798, Sally gave birth to a boy. They named him Beverly. This time, the baby survived. He grew strong, healthy, light-skinned like his sister, with Jefferson's features. Beverly didn't work in the fields. He worked as a carpenter, as a musician. He lived in the big house, not in the slave cabins. He was treated differently. Better. Because everyone knew who his father was, though no one said it aloud. In 1799, Sally gave birth to another daughter. There's no record of the name. The baby died in infancy. 3 dead children now. 1 living son. Sally was 26 years old. Jefferson was 56. He was now Vice President of the United States, the second most powerful man in the nation. And he kept returning to Monticello, kept returning to Sally. In 1801, Sally gave birth to another daughter. They also named her Harriet, like the first who had died. This Harriet survived. She was beautiful, light-skinned, straight hair, blue eyes. She didn't look like a slave, she looked like a white child from a good family. And that's exactly what she was, at least by half. That same year, Thomas Jefferson was elected President of the United States. He moved to Washington, lived in the White House, but he kept returning to Monticello every few months, spent weeks there, sometimes months, during summer when the heat in Washington was unbearable, and every time he returned, Sally was there, waiting. During these years, Jefferson was the most powerful man in America. But at Monticello, in that small room next to his, lived his secret. The Monticello slaves knew. The neighbors suspected. Visitors noticed the light-skinned children who resembled the president, but no one spoke, not publicly, until someone did. In September 1802, a journalist named James Callender published an article in the Richmond Recorder. Callender had been Jefferson's ally, had supported him politically, but the two had quarreled. Callender wanted revenge, and he had the perfect story to destroy Jefferson. The article stated that President Jefferson kept one of his slaves as a concubine, that her name was Sally, that she had borne him several children, that these children lived at Monticello, that they resembled Jefferson, that everyone in Virginia knew it but no one dared say it. Callender wrote with specific details, names, ages, descriptions. He wasn't inventing. He was reporting what he had heard, what many knew, what no one had dared publish. The scandal exploded. Newspapers across the country reproduced the story. Jefferson's political enemies, the Federalists, used the article to attack him. They published obscene cartoons, wrote satirical poems, called him a hypocrite, said the man who had written that all men are created equal had enslaved children, that the president of the nation kept a slave mistress, that he was a liar, a fraud, a man without morals. Jefferson didn't respond, never denied the article, never confirmed anything, simply kept silent. His daughters defended their father, said it was impossible, that he would never do such a thing, that the light-skinned children at Monticello were children of Jefferson's nephews, not of him, that Callender was lying out of revenge. But Jefferson himself never said anything, not a single public word about Sally Hemings, not a single denial, not a single confirmation. The scandal eventually passed. Jefferson was re-elected in 1804, served his second full term, and kept returning to Monticello, kept seeing Sally, kept having children with her, because power protects, and Jefferson had all the power. Sally had none. In 1805, Sally gave birth to a son. They named him Madison. He was her fifth living child. Beverly was 7 years old. Harriet was 4. Madison grew up knowing who his father was. Years later, when he was an adult and free, he gave an interview to a newspaper. He told the entire story, said his father was Thomas Jefferson, that his mother was Sally Hemings, that he had grown up at Monticello knowing this, that everyone knew, that no one spoke of it, but that it was true. In 1808, Sally gave birth to her last child. They named him Eston. He had the lightest skin of all, could pass completely as white. Years later, when he was free, he changed his surname, called himself Eston Hemings Jefferson, took his father's surname, the surname he legally never had the right to use, but that was his by blood. Sally Hemings had 6 children by Thomas Jefferson. 4 survived to adulthood. Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston, all light-skinned, all with Jefferson's features, all slaves by birth, because the law said children followed the condition of the mother. It didn't matter who the father was. If the mother was a slave, the children were slaves. Even if the father was the President of the United States, even if the father had written that all men are created equal, the law was clear, and the law protected men like Jefferson, never women like Sally. After the 1802 scandal, Thomas Jefferson served 2 full presidential terms, 8 years. During those years, he traveled constantly between Washington, D.C. and Monticello, spent months in the capital, then returned to Virginia. And every time he returned, Sally was there. The scandal changed nothing. Jefferson didn't sell her, didn't send her away, didn't end the relationship, simply continued as if nothing had happened, because he could, because no one could force him to do anything different. In 1809, Jefferson ended his presidency. He was 66 years old, tired of politics. He returned to Monticello to stay, to live his final years at his plantation with his white family and with Sally. She was 36 years old. She had spent half her life with Jefferson, had borne him 6 children, had lost 2, had raised 4, and was still his slave. Life at Monticello had a strange routine. Jefferson lived in the main house with his white daughters and grandchildren. Sally lived in a small room in the south building, connected to the house by a passageway. Her children lived nearby. Beverly worked as a carpenter. Harriet helped in the house. Madison and Eston were still boys. All worked, but not like the other slaves. Not in the fields under the sun, not being whipped by overseers. They worked in the house, learned trades, had privileges that the other 300 Monticello slaves didn't have. Visitors noticed the light-skinned children, asked who they were. The slaves answered evasively. They're part of the Hemings family. They're good workers. They have white blood. But they never said whose. Everyone knew, but no one said it aloud. It was the secret everyone shared, the secret they protected, because Jefferson was power. Jefferson was respected, because speaking the truth aloud would mean destroying everything. A slave named Isaac Jefferson, who worked at Monticello for years, gave an interview many years later. He spoke about life on the plantation, mentioned Sally Hemings, said she was the chambermaid to Jefferson's daughters, that she was beloved by the family, that she never worked in the fields, that she was always near Mr. Jefferson. But Isaac never said Sally was Jefferson's concubine. Never said her children were Jefferson's, though he clearly knew, because everyone knew. Jefferson's white daughters also knew, or at least suspected. They saw the Hemings children every day, saw how they resembled their father, saw the privileges they had, saw how Sally lived in a room next to Jefferson, but they never spoke of it. Years later, after Jefferson had died, Jefferson's granddaughters denied the entire story, said it was impossible, that their grandfather would never do such a thing, that the Hemings children were the children of Jefferson's nephews. They invented this story, defended it for decades, because admitting the truth meant admitting their grandfather had an enslaved family, that he had kept his dead wife's sister as a concubine. That was too shameful, too painful, so they lied, and hoped no one could prove otherwise. Years passed. Jefferson aged. He had enormous debts. The plantation didn't generate enough money. He had lived beyond his means for decades, buying books, building structures, importing wines, collecting art, all with borrowed money. By 1826, he owed the equivalent of more than 2 million current dollars. He knew that when he died, Monticello would have to be sold. The slaves would have to be sold. Everything would be lost. His white family would be left with nothing. But there was one thing Jefferson could control. He could decide which slaves to free in his will. Virginia law permitted masters to free their slaves upon death. Jefferson had freed very few slaves during his life. But now, knowing he would die soon, he had to make decisions. He decided to free 5 slaves, only 5 out of more than 100 he owned at that time. 2 of them were Sally's brothers. The other 3 were Sally's sons, Beverly, Madison, and Eston. He would free them. He kept the promise he had made to Sally 37 years earlier in Paris. But he didn't free Sally. Her name doesn't appear in the will. There's no letter of manumission for her. Nothing. After 37 years, after 6 children, after a lifetime being his concubine, Jefferson didn't free her. Perhaps he thought it wasn't necessary. Perhaps he thought his daughters would free her informally. Perhaps he simply didn't care enough. We don't know. What we know is that when Thomas Jefferson died on July 4, 1826, Sally Hemings was still legally his slave. Jefferson died in his bed at Monticello. He was 83 years old. He had lived an extraordinary life, had written the Declaration of Independence, had been governor, minister, vice president, president, had founded the University of Virginia, was considered one of America's great men, one of the founding fathers, a genius, a visionary, a hero. He died the same day as John Adams, the second president. It was seen as a sign of destiny, 2 great men dying the same day, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. It was news across the country. Newspapers published eulogies, spoke of his greatness, of his legacy, of his importance to the nation. No one mentioned Sally Hemings. No one spoke of the 6 children he had with her. No one mentioned that he had spent 38 years in a relationship with his slave, that this slave was his dead wife's sister, that he had promised to free her children, that he hadn't freed the mother. All of that was ignored, buried, forgotten, because that wasn't the story America wanted to tell about Thomas Jefferson. That wasn't the story that made him a hero. So that story disappeared, became rumor, gossip, something respectable people didn't mention. And so it remained for almost 200 years. Sally Hemings wasn't officially freed, but Jefferson's daughter Martha allowed her to leave Monticello shortly after her father's death. Sally moved to Charlottesville, the nearest city, lived with her sons Madison and Eston. She was 53 years old. For the first time in her life, she didn't live at Monticello, didn't serve the Jefferson family, wasn't anyone's property. She was de facto free, though legally still a slave until her death. Sally Hemings lived 9 more years. She died in 1835. She was 62 years old. In the 1830 census, 5 years before her death, she was registered as a white woman, not as mulatto, not as black, as white. Her children were registered as white. They had crossed the color line, had become what their skin allowed them to be, had escaped slavery, not just legally but socially, had become white, and with that, had erased their connection to Sally, to Jefferson, to the entire story. Because that was the only way to survive. That was the only way to be truly free. The 4 children of Sally Hemings who survived to adulthood took different paths after obtaining their freedom. All had skin light enough to pass as white, and all used that advantage to escape slavery in ways others couldn't. Beverly Hemings disappeared in 1822. He was 24 years old. He simply left Monticello one day and never returned. Jefferson recorded in his books that Beverly had run away, but he didn't send anyone to look for him. He let him go, kept his promise in a strange way. Beverly went north, married a white woman, lived as a white man, had children. His descendants never knew they had African blood, never knew their great-grandfather had been Thomas Jefferson. Beverly deliberately erased that story. It was the only way to be truly free. Harriet Hemings also left in 1822. She was 21 years old. Jefferson gave her money for the journey, $50, enough to get far away. Harriet went to Washington, D.C., married a white man, lived as a white woman, had children. Her family never knew the truth. Harriet kept the secret until her death, because revealing the truth meant losing everything, meant being rejected by her husband, meant her children would be considered black, meant returning to social slavery. So Harriet chose silence as her. Mother had chosen silence throughout her life. Madison Hemings was different. He was officially freed in Jefferson's will in 1826. He was 21 years old. He stayed in Virginia, married a free black woman, had children, lived as a black man. And in 1873, when he was 68 years old, he gave an interview to a newspaper. He told the entire story, said his father was Thomas Jefferson, that his mother was Sally Hemings, that Sally had been Jefferson's concubine for 37 years, that all his siblings were Jefferson's children, that he had grown up at Monticello knowing this, that it wasn't a secret to anyone who lived there. Madison was the only one who told the truth publicly, the only one who wasn't afraid, the only one who didn't hide. Eston Hemings was also freed in 1826. He was 18 years old. He stayed in Virginia for a time, married, had children. But in 1852 he decided to move to Ohio, and when he moved he changed his surname, called himself Eston Hemings Jefferson, took his father's surname, the surname he legally never had the right to use, but that was his by blood. In Ohio, Eston and his family lived as white. His children married white people. Eston's descendants never knew they had African blood, but they always knew they descended from Thomas Jefferson. That part of the story they kept. Sally's part they erased. After Jefferson's death, his white family denied the entire story for more than 150 years, said it was impossible, that Jefferson would never have had a relationship with a slave, that the Hemings children were the children of Jefferson's nephews, not of him. They invented complicated stories to explain why the children resembled Jefferson so much. Said families look alike. that cousins look alike, that it was just coincidence. They attacked Madison Hemings' credibility, said he was lying, that he was seeking attention, that he wanted to associate himself with a famous name. The white Jefferson family protected his reputation for decades, and America believed them, because no one wanted to believe that a founding father had an enslaved family. Historians also denied the story for a long time, said there wasn't enough evidence, that Madison Hemings' testimony wasn't reliable, that slaves lied, that Jefferson was a man of principles, that he would never do such a thing. Some historians admitted it was possible, but most denied it, especially historians who admired Jefferson, who had dedicated their lives to studying his legacy. Admitting the truth about Sally Hemings meant admitting Jefferson was a hypocrite, that the man who wrote about equality kept his own children in slavery. That was too uncomfortable. So the story was ignored, minimized, denied. But in 1998, everything changed. A group of scientists conducted DNA tests on descendants of Eston Hemings and on descendants of the Jefferson family. The results were clear. Eston's descendants had the DNA of the Jefferson line. It couldn't be coincidence, couldn't be a nephew. It had to be Thomas Jefferson or someone very close to him in the direct line. And given that Jefferson was the only Jefferson man living at Monticello when Eston was conceived, the conclusion was obvious. Thomas Jefferson was the father of Eston Hemings, and if he was Eston's father, he was probably the father of all Sally's children, 170, 2 years after Jefferson's death. Science confirmed what Madison Hemings had said in 1873, what the Monticello slaves had always known. What Sally Hemings had lived for 37 years, Thomas Jefferson had fathered 6 children with his slave, the slave who was his dead wife's half-sister, the slave who had begun a relationship with him when she was 16, the slave who was never freed, the slave who was erased from official history for almost 2 centuries. In the year 2000, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which administers Monticello as a museum, published an official report. They acknowledged the relationship, acknowledged the children, acknowledged that the story they had denied for so long was true. They changed the exhibits at Monticello, added information about Sally Hemings, about her children, about the room where she lived, about the promise Jefferson made to her in Paris, about the 38 years they spent together, about the fact that he never freed her. Thomas Jefferson died as one of America's great men. Sally Hemings died as a forgotten former slave. Her children were free, but they had to hide or deny who they were to live in peace. Some chose to be white, others chose to be black. But all carried the weight of a secret America didn't want to know. The secret that the man who wrote that all men are created equal had 6 children with his slave and never publicly acknowledged them, never freed them until they turned 21, and never freed their mother. This is the story America buried for 200 years, the story that only science could confirm, the story of the president and the slave, of power and powerlessness, of hypocrisy and survival, of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and the 6 children born in the shadow of America's most powerful man.